Oftentimes when I hear people talk about school choice and the New Orleans model, and they talk about what a success it is, I go, okay, well, what exactly is success? So if your goal was to educate children, help a community, then no, it was a failure. But if your goal was to break up the black community, break up the black power structure, take wealth from an already poor community, undereducate people, condition and control, then yes, it was a beautiful success, right? If your goal was to condition and control, if your goal was to make sure you had a population of people that don't know how to unionize, then yes, it was a success. I talk to a lot of parents who will call me and ask me, what are the good schools in New Orleans? How do you choose schools? So I always tell parents, I choose the schools that I feel are going to do the least amount of harm to my children. I do not suffer under the delusion that my children will not be harmed. I just choose the schools that will do the least amount of harm, because unfortunately I didn't take my own advice and marry rich, just in case y'all were wondering. And something that's happening in our choice system is people have the choice to decide not to follow the law, apparently. We don't have that choice, but apparently charter schools are magical entities in which they get to choose not to obey federal and state law. Now you might say, Ashana, you're lying. I promise you there are a lot of schools that are not following federal and state law. Because if you have children with severe issues like asthma, heart problems, lung problems, you're supposed to have a medical person on staff while you have those children in that school. The percentages of asthma and chronic conditions in the city of New Orleans, unfortunately, are extremely high. The majority of our charters contract with nurses maybe twice a week. Maybe. So you are not going to have a nurse on staff full time in most of the schools. You're not going to have a true counselor or therapist. You will have whatever they give you, because they have autonomy to choose who they hire and don't hire. So a lot of times it puts our families in peril. We have a lot of special education that's not happening the way it's supposed to, as Karen talked about, because you have a lot of people that are not certified in special education teaching special education classes. And there's a lot of schools you'll go to and they'll just say, well, you know what, we don't know anything about autism. I'm sorry. So could you hire somebody? Well, that's on our to-do list. We have a lot of our children are on free and reduced lunch. Yet we have a lot of charter schools with uniform shirts that range anywhere from $24 to $44. And if you can't buy them, a lot of them will tell you can't come to school, which is, again, against the law. But, you know, what's the law? So let me wrap that up and finish by saying that, no, this is not something that should be imported unless, again, your goal is to dismantle a city, is to take from the people who already have the least, is to entrench segregation. Because let me say this, we already had a very segregated school system before the storm, but it has gotten worse, much worse. Not only that, but now we have a situation where a lot of local black people can't even get jobs inside of the school system. Like, they will not hire us. And it's not because of our Southern accents. It is because a lot of our locally educated teachers actually do know early childhood brain development. They actually do know adolescent development, and they will tell schools, you cannot do this. What do you mean we're not giving 5-year-olds recess? What do you mean we're doing quiet lunch? That's messing with their social emotional development. That's inappropriate. Anyway, all that to say, that is happening. Again, quiet lunches, no recess, no music, no art, happening all over the city. So when people talk about choice, it's a choice between bad and really, really bad. It's not a choice between good and bad. And most of the few, we have a handful of schools that they'll pull out, Morris Jeff, Bricolage, some other schools that they'll say, look at our wonderful schools, but it's a handful of schools. And most of those schools have at least 50%, not just white children, but middle and upper middle class white children. People were already suffering with trauma. And then the storm exacerbated that. So you had a lot more people who had trauma. And so what the schools do is they create prison-like environments to deal with trauma. And I want people to imagine, like, imagine you broke your arm. And you go to school, you're like, I'm in pain. And they say, you know what we need you to do? Shut up and sit down and walk on this line, and that's going to fix it. If you're not tracking me with your eyes, you can get anywhere from a demerit to suspension. If you're not sitting up straight, if you fall asleep, if you have the wrong color belt, if you have an undershirt underneath your uniform shirt that I can see that's the wrong color, I may suspend you. I mean, literally anything. And depending on the school, they will use that, especially with special needs children, because they're trying to push them out. But they have autonomy. So they believe that's autonomy to do anything they want to do.
My criticism has been about education reform in this current movement is that for test score gain, many of my colleagues are willing to give up jobs, willing to give up transportation, willing to give up the other essential goods that uplift children. What was happening in New Orleans, what made Katrina one of the greatest, if not the greatest man-made disaster, was not just education. It was bad policy in policing, bad policy in housing, across the board. And yet, when we measured what works in New Orleans schools, we look at test scores. We do not look at, are we becoming more efficient in getting kids to school? Are kids going to jail less? Are they suspended less? Are they getting special needs services? These were the problems that existed long before charter schools. These are the problems that we need reform for. I argue, just like in New Orleans, just like it is in DC, just like in other places where reform has landed hard, we have reduced the quality of overall quality of life of families. Kids don't live in schools. They live in communities. And as long as reforms don't attend to all of those other structures or help uplift those other structures, we're contradicting ourselves. All the research shows that black teachers add value. Yet in New Orleans, in DC, in other places, when reform hit, when charter schools in particular hit, the black teacher population decreased. We're not going to fire our way to success. We're not going to move the furniture of schools around toward success. Many of the reforms that we see today are predicated on this belief that black people are causing their own problems. So therefore, we can fire them, we can take away their schools, we can take away their districts. Many of the reforms we see today would never happen in a white district. Never.
Post-Hurricane Katrina, just as we came back, I was met with my son's public school becoming a charter school. Oftentimes, charter advocates would say, well, charter schools offer parents a choice. Well, in order to have a choice, you have to have a base to start from. So we didn't have a neighborhood school, so we could say, okay, well, I'm going to stay here, or maybe I'll choose this school over there. That was not the option for us. We had to jump into this fray. The school system only had a few schools that were non-charter. So really, we don't have much choice but to put our kids in charter schools because we have no option for neighborhood schools. They made the system worse. Certainly our school system needed improvement. Those of us who were here trying to improve our school system had some ideas for how we want to rebuild our neighborhood and rebuild our school system. And many of us tried. I was one of them. Tried to rebuild the school in my neighborhood, and then we were forced to make that school a charter school, even though We had gone to many planning meetings for rebuilding our community and the kinds of schools we wanted to be rooted in our community, but we were forced to make them charter schools. The charter school mafia, if you want to call it that, they took over the policy making in our city, in our state, such that really locals had no real say if you wanted something other than a charter. Parents of children with disabilities, early in the process, it was clear that we were not wanted. The schools were not set up to really serve children with disabilities. Many of these schools were run by people who had never run schools before. They did not have the expertise. They did not have the professionals needed to serve some children with more severe needs. We also had to face the problem of school closing. So once parents went through all of this process to choose a school, oftentimes they would find that their school would close, sometimes that very next school year. We supported parents of, I remember the Lanyap Charter School. People were wondering, well, why is this person who's against charter schools out there helping these parents whose charter school closed? Well, the bottom line, these are parents and these are children, and they are now victims of what is called a reform. And I would say that it doesn't work. Oftentimes when I travel and speak about this, I say that New Orleans is like the canary in the mine, and the canary has died.